In this video, we're embarking on a voyage back in time to uncover the legacy of Gioachino Greco, one of the earliest known chess legends and a pioneer of the Latvian Gambit, an opening notorious for its wild and tricky positions. In the first game, white starts e4 and Greco replies e5. White's knight f3 attacks the pawn, and Greco comes out of nowhere with f5. This is the Latvian Gambit, an incredibly aggressive opening for black. Black is baiting white into giving up their valuable central pawn in order to gain full control over the center. The e-pawn is also hanging, however, and white takes that one instead. This is the most common reply to the gambit. Black lifts his queen to f3, developing her with tempo, and white puts a second pawn in the center in order to support their knight. Greco pushes d6, attacking the knight while awakening the rest of his minor pieces. After the knight retreats to c4, black regains the pawn, capturing on e4. White's knight c3 attacks the pawn, so the black queen sidesteps to g6, defending while making way for the knight to develop. White breaks with f3, trying to get rid of black's powerful central pawn, and black defends it with knight f6. Once white takes it, black doesn't recapture, bringing out his bishop instead and setting a subtle trap for his opponent. White, noticing the weakened diagonal near their king, develops their bishop to e3, maintaining a defensive stance. Only now does black snatch the pawn on e4, and white plays the move that's screaming at all of us. Bishop d3, seemingly a potent pin. Yet, white just took the bait. Greco captures the pawn on g2, hitting the rook, but sacrificing their knight. Now white could try queen h5 check to create complications, but black would just block with g6. The rook would still be hanging, so white would have to accept the knight in order to defend the rook. Black would just capture the rook, sacrificing their queen temporarily once the bishop recaptures, before getting the queen back, ending up an exchange ahead. Instead, white just takes the knight immediately in order to counterattack the queen and defend the rook. Greco's deceptive scheme culminates in these next couple of moves. Can you find black's checkmate in 2? To take full advantage of the serious weakness around white's king, the move Greco plays is bishop h4 check. White's only defense is with the bishop blocking, and black's queen takes it, giving checkmate on f2. The second opponent meets the Latvian Gambit with bishop c4, completely ignoring the offer and taking an aggressive approach. Greco captures the pawn on e4, hitting the knight, who in turn takes on e5, where it coordinates with the bishop on f7. Black brings out his strongest piece immediately as the queen attacks both the pawn on g2 and the knight. White could play knight f2, but things would get tricky after black would take the pawn on g2, hitting the rook, and proceed with d5, attacking the bishop while opening up his own. Black would have quick development to build an attack on the uncastled king. Instead, white goes for d4, protecting his knight, noticing that were the pawn to capture en passant, they could take it back with the knight. Greco's queen grabs the pawn on g2, hitting the rook, and white counters with queen h5 check. Black blocks it with g6 before white's bishop, with the knight's help, swoops into f7 with another check. The king sidesteps and white takes on g6, exploiting the pin on the pawn to the rook. Then black takes the rook in the corner with his queen, who then skewers the king and bishop. At this point, black is up a rook, but his king is in a tough spot. White could defend their bishop with king d2, but black could follow with e3, check to remove the pawn and continue checking the white king. Instead, white moves the king to e2, allowing black to capture the bishop so that they can carry on with their attack. They start with knight f2 check. The king moves over a square and white checks again with queen e5. Black blocks with the knight, then white takes the rook in the corner with their knight while giving check. Greco captures the bishop in return, and while white got the rook back, it was in exchange for 2 bishops. White follows with knight c3, weaving a subtle trap, and black's next move is crucial to winning the game. Can you find black's winning move? The rook in the corner appears to be free, but taking it would be a huge mistake. If it were to happen, white would capture on e4 with the knight, and the threat of knight f6 check, followed by knight f7 checkmate, would be hard to stop. Queen takes a2, defending the square, would be met by knight f6 check, and then d5, cutting the queen off. the black queen would have to give herself up to stop checkmate. Black's only other option would be moving the bishop to give room to the king. White would play knight f6 check, forcing the king to f8 to avoid mate. Then they would take on g6. The black knight would take it, allowing the queen to come to e8 with check. After king g7, the knight would move to h5 with another check, and the king would have to stay nearby to defend the knight. But the queen would push the king away before capturing the knight with the threat of taking on h6 with check, followed by going to g7 with checkmate. Black would have to play queen c1 to defend the bishop, but like in the last variation, white would block the queen's vision with f4, and black would have to give her up in order to stop the checkmate. Back to the game. Greco probably didn't calculate that far before concluding that he shouldn't take the rook. The move he plays, and the best move, is queen takes c2 check. The king taking one step forward would be like the first domino falling, as it would keep getting pushed forward, losing everything along the way. If the king went to f1 instead, then d6 attacking the queen while opening up the bishop to harass the white king would be frightening. So His Highness retreats to e1. Black takes on b2, hitting the rook, and white, in one final desperate bid for survival, takes the pawn on e4 to follow through with their planned combination. In this case, however, Greco takes the rook with check before he takes the pawn on a2, simultaneously giving check and defending against white's only threat. White's plans are foiled, and they have no choice but to resign. Once the king would move, black would have time to play d6, and white's attack would be completely shut down. Black is already up a whole bunch of material, and it won't take long for him to consolidate his position before turning things around. In the third game, the opponent accepts the gambit. Black makes use of the open space to push his pawn, hitting the knight, who jumps to e5. Knight f6 develops, and g4 is an aggressive approach looking to hold on to the pawn and maybe even push black's pieces back. Black follows with d6, attacking the knight, and it drops to c4. Then black pushes h6 to avoid any funny business on the king side, and white develops his bishop on the long diagonal, pressuring the pawn. Greco pushes forward with d5, hitting the knight and fortifying his center. White puts the knight on e3, and black attacks it again with d4, gaining substantial space. White returns the knight to c4, and as if it were a punching bag, black strikes it again with b5, and the poor knight has probably had enough. Now white could hop it to e5, and knight g6 would be problematic. But it's sometimes scary to wander off alone into enemy territory, so the knight retreats to a3, attacking the pawn, which black defends with a6. Then white plays e3, opening up his bishop while attacking the pawn on e4, and black defends by fianchettoing his bishop on the long diagonal. White takes the pawn, black recaptures with the knight, and white challenges it with knight d2. Greco catapults his bishop to b4, pinning the knight to the king. Now white should probably castle his king to safety, but they choose to break the pin with c3, and here's where things start to go south for them. Black takes the pawn, and were white to recapture, black would take it with his knight, hitting the queen and opening up an attack on the bishop, which would win it. So, with the pin broken, white says, "Hey look, free knight," and gobbles it. Now white is about to get obliterated, and there's nothing they can do about it. Greco bites down on the pawn on b2, opening the bishop's check on the king. White blocks with the bishop, and black takes it with check. The queen recapturing would allow black to get a full queen for free. So white takes with the knight, opening the bishops to one another. Black takes it, hitting the rook, who slides over one square. Now black has a really slick move here to win a whole bunch of material. Can you find the best move for black? Greco, in fact, does not find this move, but hopefully you spotted that the white king is fairly restricted. Black does not, but could play queen e7 check. White's only reply would be queen e2, and black would not only win the rook, but would get a second queen on the board, which would be pretty cool. Back to the game. Greco is satisfied with just the rook, capturing it with his pawn, who promotes to a queen. White immediately takes it, and the game is not quite over as black has to avoid any tricks. He could retreat his bishop who was under attack, but this would allow white to take the pawn on g7, which could cause complications. So black castles, letting white take the bishop. He then craftily continues with queen e7 check, forking the king and the knight. Once the king moves and he takes the knight, re-establishing his lead of a full rook, all while his position is robust, white decides to call it a day and resigns the game. The fourth opponent replies to the Latvian Gambit by capturing on e5 with the knight. This time Greco lifts his queen to e7, skewering the knight and the pawn. White follows with the threatening queen h5 check. Moving the king would be met by knight f7, which would ask for trouble with discovered checks. So black's only choice is blocking with g6. White takes it with their knight, exploiting the pin on the pawn to the rook. This, however, opens the queen to capture on e4 with check. The king sidesteps to d1. Greco shrewdly develops his knight to f6, attacking the queen, so that if there were a discovered check, black could just take the queen. White retreats Her Majesty to h3 before black captures the knight, sacrificing the rook, which white eats up. Then black leaps the knight to g4 with the serious threat of knight f2 checkmate. White only has two good replies here. Bishop e2 would block the queen's vision down the e-file so that after knight takes f2 check, the king could shift over to e1. Black would be able to pick up the knight, but would probably lose the trapped knight eventually, making material even. The other option would be d3, and we'll see what would happen if white were to play d3 in the next game. Instead of both of these, white goes for queen h4, defending the f2 pawn in an attempt to hold on to as much material as possible. This is a grave mistake, and black has one move to win the game. Can you find it? With the white queen undefended and on the same line as black's queen, the move Greco plays is knight e3 check. After white takes the knight, black captures the queen, getting a queen for a rook. With black's decisive material advantage, white resigns the game. The final game plays out similarly to the last one. White meets the Latvian Gambit by capturing on e5. Black lifts his queen, skewering the knight and pawn, before white swoops the queen to h5 with check. Dodging check would be a disaster, so black blocks with g6. White takes it, exploiting the pin on the pawn, but allowing black to take on e4 with check. The king sidesteps, and black develops the knight to f6, attacking the queen, who retreats to h3. Greco takes the knight with his pawn, sacrificing the exchange, which white accepts. Then he hops the knight to g4, threatening knight f2 checkmate. Last game we saw what would happen were white to play bishop e2. The other good option is the one white plays, d3, attacking the queen and giving the king a free square. Black takes the pawn with the knight, giving check, and the king moves to d2. Greco slides his queen to g4, threatening queen d1, which would win at least the bishop, but it would also push the king out into the open, and black could start building up a brutal attack. Now white could stop this with knight c3, but then black would take the rook. White would have promising attacking opportunities, but they would also be down a full piece. So white stops the threat by playing bishop e2, counterattacking the queen. Greco shifts the queen over to f4 with check, giving white two options. King e1 would be met by knight takes d3, a desperado sacrifice, before black would take the hanging bishop, which would then skewer the king and the rook. Once the king would move, black could take the rook, but it could become risky after bishop f1, boxing in the queen behind the pawns, king, and bishop. Black wouldn't have to take the rook, and white would be up the exchange, but with their king in the open, black would have a promising attack. Instead, white plays king c3, giving black a checkmate in one. Can you find it? With the king stranded in no man's land, the move Greco plays is queen b4, using the bishop's support to deliver checkmate. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.